Okay, it is now 12:05, and so I resume the hearing. Let us move then to issue 8.2, and that is in relation to policies R1 to R4. And I think as previously, as we did with the EC policies, if we simply take them one at a time and in order. Mr. Jones, you're very, very quick off the mark.
Yeah, good morning. I'm happy. I don't know if the council want to make any comments first. I'm happy to go straight to my points, if you like, sir.
What I prefer to do actually is because this is R1 is a policy where the council has proposed modifications. So what I'm generally sort of doing is hearing from the council where they've proposed modifications to make sure that I understand what the mod is and why the council's put it forward. And then I'll come absolutely immediately straight to you after Mr. Jones. But first of all then, Mr. Linus.
Thank you, sir. I won't set out a general introduction to the retail policies because it's been set out in full in the hearing statement. As far as the modifications are concerned, I think the changes to R1 are just intended to be slightly more specific and clearer in terms of the need for the sequential test to be applied for proposals for uses that are outside of an identified centre. And secondly, to clarify the application of the thresholds and to confirm that they should be applied where variation of condition applications are proposed, so that proposals which potentially do have an effect on city centre through variations of conditions are caught by the policy rather than there being any doubt about that. So that's the reason for the second change, and there aren't any associated changes proposed to the supporting text.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, sir. The point I wanted to make was a single point really, which is set out in our written statement on the matter. The question we're being asked is, do policies R1 to R4 deal effectively with the retail sector? As I think you know, obviously my interest is in relation to the British Sugar site in particular. We made representations previously on the site-specific policy for British Sugar itself. That policy, SS6, identifies the key principles for the delivery of that site. And in those key principles, the provision of and the delivery of local retail is specifically identified. So therefore, the draft policy SS6 supports the provision of appropriate local retail facilities at site ST1, which is British Sugar, as part of the stated key principles for that site. And therefore, in our view, in order to ensure that the draft retail policies are consistent with the site-specific policy, they should identify and reflect the support for appropriate retail provision on the strategic site. As it stands at the moment, my reading of the policies, and even as proposed to be modified, is that there's no reference to the retail provision or support for retail provision on any of the strategic sites. And therefore, in our view, this should be rectified to ensure that those retail policies, and I think specifically policy R1, are consistent with the strategic site allocations and are effective in offering support for local retail facilities on those sites, and in my case, obviously, the British Sugar site. So we've provided in our statement some suggested additional wording for policy R1 that would have the effect of specifically identifying that support for local retail on the strategic sites where appropriate. And that would have the effect of, if you like, excluding such development, such retail development from the impact test in particular. That's everything from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Linus.
Thank you, sir. If you look at paragraph 4.24 of the plan as proposed to be modified, it falls under policy R2, but the point is a general one. We say that we have actually picked up on the relationship between strategic policies and retail policies, as that paragraph confirms. So there isn't we would say, an inconsistency when the plan is read as a whole. And we say in 424 that subject to detailed viability delivery work as part of the site master planning, local convenience and retail provision may be required to support the provision of local day-to-day shopping needs through the development of new centres and some of the strategic housing allocations. Proposal for any new retail development at the strategic sites will be subject to detailed sequential tests and retail impact assessment in accordance with policy R1, and the scale of any retail development should be considered through a master planned approach. So as we see it, to the extent that any policy for strategic sites, including the British Sugar site, refers to retail development, it would still have to go through the policy tests in R1 through to R4, and paragraph 4.24 confirms that. So we don't see the need for the modifications which are suggested, and if one looks at the modifications which are proposed in any event, they would introduce potentially wide scope for retail development and still maintain uncertainty. The suggestion in the Rapley's statement, on one view, effectively allows a rather open approach to retail policy within strategic sites without the control that we would want to achieve through R1 to R4. So we think that the policy in R2, paragraph 4.24, gives sufficient confirmation that anything on a strategic site would still have to comply with the retail policies. If, however, sir, you look at the policy for the British Sugar site and think that there's an amendment which needs to be made to reflect what is said in 4.24, we can look at that, but our primary position is when one looks at the plan as a whole, it's quite clear that any support for retail on the strategic sites is qualified by reference to having to pass the retail policy test the normal way.
Just to try and answer that rather than repeat all those points, I think it's probably in fairness, it's right to recognise that this issue also applies with other strategic sites, that there are references to retail provision with those. I think the main point from that, though, is that really reinforces all the points that Mr. Linus has just made in terms of the potential sort of impact of that on individual sites and across the range of strategic sites. And I probably am repeating the point that's made here, really, that I think it's about ensuring that the fundamental objectives of the retail policies in the plan about supporting the network of centres and supporting their vitality and viability, that really these policies do need to work together, and this is the right way around of doing it to ensure that those wider objectives are achieved, as well as bringing forward the strategic sites in the right way. Thank you.
Just so I'm clear, on the strategic sites, we're talking about local retail provision, aren't we?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, just can you explain to me, Mr. James, what your concern is in terms of potential outcome with the policies as they're currently worded? Are you worried that they might lead to an outcome that, in your view, isn't right?
I think so. Our concern is that as currently drafted, if I understand them correctly, for any retail provision of any scale, sort of over and above the identified thresholds within the policy, even though that retail provision would be in line with the key principles for the strategic site, one would have to go through the threshold test. Now, I'm not saying that that may well be something that could be satisfied through an application, but it seems to me that where you're bringing forward retail floor space in line with key principles for a strategic site, it then seems unnecessary for that element of the strategic development to have to satisfy the impact test, because it's in line with the key principles for the site itself. It seems to me it's unnecessary to have that additional level of restriction for the development to pass.
And the council proactively seeks this element of retail provision on these strategic sites, doesn't it?
Well, sir, in the case of British Sugar, it refers to social infrastructure meeting the needs of future residents, including local retail. But as I've said, the intention is that that policy is read in the context of the retail policies to provide a degree of control, or I should say control, over the scale of development that comes forward in those locations. I think the concern is that without the cross-application of R1 through to R4, there wouldn't be a sufficient degree of control over exactly what came forward through any individual planning application on the site. So one needs to make sure that there's proper application of the normal tests to which any retail provision is made subject.
Can I just put a scenario forward? If I'm looking at the thresholds in R1, and when I'm putting together my planning application for a strategic site, so if my master plan includes some retail provision to accord with what's in the SS policy, I'm not going to do this on a site-specific basis. I would have to include that some discussion of the sequential test and a retail impact assessment if, because I'm outside a local centre, presumably on a strategic site, anything bigger than 200 square metres gross floor space. Am I reading that correctly?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, just to help us out, 200 square metres isn't an especially large shop, is it?
10 by 20.
No, I think is the answer. But I think the broad principle is that even if there's a relatively low threshold in relation to sites outside a local centre, it doesn't of itself mean that permission is going to be refused on the strategic site. We're just asking for the proper policy approach to be applied, so that to the extent that any support is envisaged on the strategic sites, that needs to be read subject to the application of the retail policy in R1. Accepting that the threshold is 200 square metres outside a local centre.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so, if I may. You've identified the nub of the issue, which is that the threshold, the way the thresholds are written, it seems that for any strategic site, the threshold is incredibly low. And as I say, it just seems it's an overly zealous test to put on each of the strategic sites where local retail is being specifically encouraged as part of those developments.
Well, it's been specifically sought, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Sorry, hence why in our statements we've suggested that one appropriate way of dealing with it is to include within the hierarchy, if you like, or the hierarchy within policy R1, those strategic sites where local retail is specifically being sought, so that they're excluded, if you like, from what we see as the rather overzealous tests.
So you could say, for example, looking at the 3 bullet points in R1, add an extra. I'm thinking on my feet a little bit here, which is always dangerous. But you could add an additional bullet point which dealt with on strategic sites where there is provision for local retail, and then have a threshold for that. I suppose the problem would be, continuing to think on my feet, is that each strategic site would be different, because some strategic sites are much bigger than others.
I mean, I wouldn't attempt to start drafting the policy here and now. I don't feel qualified to do that, but certainly in our statements...
Neither are we, but we're going to have a go.
in our statements, we've suggested that where there is reference to retail provision outside the defined city, district and local centres, yes, at that point we've suggested an additional form of wording which would be or not in accordance with the strategic site policies. Oh, yeah. So that it's clear that there's support elsewhere in the plan on those strategic sites for a level of retail provision.
Yeah, I mean, in effect, on the strategic sites, isn't the plan seeking to create a new local centre?
So, as just been alluded to, the strategic sites are at different scales. So certainly when we're talking about the largest of those strategic sites, you'd expect a commensurate level of local retail provision alongside the other social and community infrastructure highlighted within the policy. The site allocations associated with those strategic sites don't define a level of retail floor space in them that's expected to be delivered in the way that it does, of course, with housing. And so these policies working together are there's an acceptance about the retail use in these locations, but it's to manage that overall impact for some of these sites, which thinking about the largest sites, developed out over a long period of time, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I do kind of wonder if the plan is sort of pulling in 2 directions here, because on the one hand it's saying we proactively want some level of local retail on the strategic site, but then on the other hand it's saying, well, but only if you, developer, can demonstrate that that's not going to be a problem in terms of impacts on other retailing, in effect. And I wonder if, rather than requiring an impact assessment, it might be more about defining in the strategic site policies, and without wishing to sound too Royston Vasey, but local shop for local people, or give some definition as a policy hook rather than requiring an impact assessment. I wonder if that would achieve the same outcome, because that would give you control in terms of preventing excessive, if that's the council's concern, preventing excessive retailing coming forward on the strategic sites.
Yes, sir. I mean, I think we can take that away. One thing, again, thinking aloud on my feet as well, one way perhaps of framing it is that where in the strategic policies there's reference made to meeting needs for future relevance in local retail, we put in something requiring that any application must demonstrate that retail provision is either primarily or exclusively for the needs of the residents on the site, so that you drill down to the restricted purpose for which the retail is to be provided.
Can we call that the Royston-Vasey test?
So yes, we won't ask for bonus points for putting that in the supporting text, but we understand precisely what you mean. I think we can take that. I think we can take that away. I think the concern we've got is that if you leave the strategic policies too loose and you don't have some reference point to control them, which we were using R1 to R4, you have uncertainty in the application of policy, and carried across the strategic policies as a whole, it's difficult to control. So we need to think about how the supporting text might actually give you an extra degree of control beyond the threshold, but we can take that away.
I suppose we would also have to be a little careful about expanding this discussion into other strategic sites, because there's no representative here.
I think that's why the idea was to cross-refer to R1 to R4, because if those policy requirements were met, then there couldn't be any dispute over the appropriateness of retail on these strategic sites. And it was possibly a neater way of doing it and provided greater certainty, bearing in mind that we're not saying you can't do it. All we're saying is you have to produce an impact assessment to show it's acceptable. And on balance, it was thought initially that was the preferred approach, rather than trying to adopt an approach to wording relating to what local retail and what needs of future residents means, which would essentially boil down to something that's actually different to the R1, R4 approach. There was greater certainty over the application of a threshold than coming up with another form of words to define what needs of future residents actually means. And I think as well, the R1 to R4, I understand that the thresholds there were drawn from work that was done by the council based on the experience of White Young Green, who looked at this. Mr. Wood has something to say about that.
If it helps, just sort of a point of source on this, which is SD 65, the White Young Green retail study sets out the rationale for the thresholds based on their experience and work elsewhere, just to identify where they've come from.
I mean, it may be, sir, that we put into the policy something which isn't substantially departing from the terms of the main strategic policies, which say we require information to be submitted, which demonstrates any retail provision is on a local basis only and does not go beyond meeting the needs of future residents so as to cause an unacceptable impact on other centres.
Yeah, I suspect that something might like that might just be the thing, okay. Because yeah, I do have some slight concerns of the sort expressed by Mr. Jones on this. So rather than, well, we're often tempted, aren't we, to make it up on the hoof, as we have been a bit this morning. But perhaps if we could ask the council to go and give that a little bit more careful thought, rather than coming up with something specific now. Although I suspect, Mr. Linus, that you may well be on the right lines. Yeah. Okay.
Well, obviously, we will do that. Sir, one would anticipate there may be some vagaries in the precise drafting, but we'll certainly look at that. I think it's clear what mischief we're trying to address through the policy. It's just a case of the wording being tight enough to achieve it.
It's the specific mechanism, isn't it? And whether the mechanism is thresholds or whether it's, which is numbers, or whether it's words,
yes.
Very possibly. But it may be a little bit more than that, because it's, about whether you need to do a full impact assessment is the kind of issue underlying all of this, probably, isn't it? So, yeah, if we could ask you maybe to sort of think about that and do a short, nice, concise paper on the outcome of your deliberations, which clearly explains why you've reached the conclusion that you have, I'd be really grateful.
We'll do that. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Jones, did you have anything you wanted to add? Thank you. It's been helpful.
So it's probably worth a hurried journey.
Well, we'll see the council paper, but yes, I think so.
Ye of little faith. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Is there anything else on policy R1? Okay, good. Then let us go to R2. District and local centres and neighbourhood parades.
You'll see that there are main modifications proposed to R2, which are essentially there to avoid duplication, which is covered in R1 already, and there's a change to 4.24, which we've been looking at before, which may need to be part of the review that we've committed to, because we need to look at 4.24 as well as R1, the strategic policies. But the original intention behind that modification was just to confirm that the sequential test and the retail impact assessment would need to be considered not simply a retail impact assessment, but that may be superseded by our consideration of the issue you mentioned.
Are you here to talk about this one, Mr. Jones?
Well, I think the only thing for me to say is that my comments were directed at R1. So only insofar as I think they sort of merge over to an extent to R2, but it was the same point, really. There's nothing additional for me to add.
Okay, I don't have any additional points or questions that I want to pick up on. Anybody else here for R2? No, okay. In which case then, let us move to R3, York City Centre Retail. Mr. Linus.
Thank you, sir. Very small changes proposed to this policy to reflect the use class change, and also to make it slightly clearer in the nomenclature that rather than referring, for example, to consider favourably, it's clearer just to say we will permit something along the usual approach to making policies as clear as possible as to when they will be allowed or rejected. But beyond that, there weren't any changes to these policies.
I think there is one small thing in here that might flow from what we've just discussed in terms of R1 and strategic sites, is the last little bit about York Central. I don't know whether that needs to be considered in the same way as the other strategic sites. It may well be.
It may well just be a sort of checking point, but we will take note of that and make sure that any changes that we are contemplating to other parts don't introduce an inconsistency with 435.
Mr. Merritt.
I'm just conscious of, from my previous involvement, that retail was always a really big issue with York Central, and you know, with the council having very significant concerns about potential knock-ons for the existing city centre. So I think it might be in a different category from the other much more remote sites in terms of this one definitely needing very careful consideration of the retail functions, that it doesn't undermine the city centre but complements.
And is that because of its size and proximity to the centre?
Yes, and at one stage it was, you know, it was being pushed that it should be a retail-led development. Yeah, that's the background.
Yeah, do you think, Mr. Linus, that your consideration of the issue further is likely to result in some differentiation of the strategic sites?
It may do, sir. I'm just looking at policy SS4 on York Central, which is drafted differently to some of the other strategic policies. I think that potentially why the earlier policy impetus was to cross-refer to R1 to R4 for that reason. And we take the point about York Central having specific treatment within the plan. Yes. I think we can certainly consider the position around, as we've said, but we do take on board Mr. Merritt's point that there was concern in relation to the proximity of York Central to the city centre. I think all I can say now is that insofar as we're looking at the strategic sites approach to retail, we'll just have to make sure that nothing comes in as part of that process which qualifies the treatment of that concern on York Central. So we'll take that away, but we will have Mr. Merritt's point.
Sorry, just reading across between SS4, policy SS4, the York Central policy, and the little bit which deals with York Central at the end of R3. It might be the way I'm reading it, but I think that there's well, I'm scratching my head a bit about ancillary retail uses and non-ancillary, and I wonder whether that could be clearer. Because it's the SS4 says the following mix of uses will be permitted within York Central. Then it has non-ancillary retail subject to an impact and sequential assessment. And then in the R3 policy, it talks about ancillary retail uses will be supported.
I think that we understand the point, sir. It may be a case for further clarity to be provided in the supporting text. I think the general idea is it's supposed to be, ancillary retail is supposed to be retail that's there to support the other uses that are on the site.
Yeah, that's right.
But we take the point that given its reference in the body of the policy, there might be some benefit in explaining that within the supporting text. We'll take that away, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that the SS4 policy needs to say ancillary retail, comma, and non-ancillary retail subject to an impact and sequential assessment or something like that. So it makes clear that it's happy with ancillary retail. That is, you know, some small shops that support what's going on, all that office accommodation and so on. But anything that's not doing that would be subject to an assessment, because I think that's fair enough.
I think that's fair, isn't it? Yeah, that's fair, sir.
Yep.
Yeah, good.
Mr. Merritt? Yeah. Yeah, I'm good with that. Anything else on R3? If we move on to R4, which deals with out-of-centre retailing. Was there anything you wanted to say about that one, Mr. Lyons?
No, sir, beyond that, reflecting the well-established approach to out-of-centre retailing in national policy. This is a policy where we're not proposing any modifications. We don't understand it to be a major in-principle dispute over R4.
Anyone on R4? Okay, very good, thank you. Which then I think brings us to issue 8.3 and policy SS3. And we have some proposed changes, Mr. Lyons, which most of which at least relate to the changes in the use classes order.
That's right, sir. Yes, that's the main purpose of the changes. There are no changes to the explanatory text, and all the changes in the body of the policy relate to the use classes point, yes.
Is anyone here to say anything about policy SS3?
Just one small point of clarification. I understand from reading this policy that parts of the York Central site are within the city centre, within what the council regards as the zone of the city centre. But not the whole.
That's correct, sir. Yes. I'm just looking back to see if that was picked up within the earlier paragraph that we were looking at, sir.
Yes, because there might be a complication there, mightn't there? Because a retail development in the part of that site which is within the city centre might have to be dealt with differently to one that was outside that area, so outside the city centre. But it may not amount to anything. But
I think that's true. I mean, it's a long time since there were regular retail inquiries doing the rounds, but it wasn't actually that unusual a circumstance to deal with, because I spent many weeks arguing over where lines were drawn on the plan and whether it actually made any difference. But I think that's right, sir. Part of the site is in the centre, part of it is edge of centre, and I think it really depends on the proposals that came forward at the time. You inevitably have to apply policy, but one has to look at the circumstances of individual cases and what's proposed. I don't think we can avoid the distinction between the centre and the edge of centre. It's just inherent in the way policy works.
Yeah. Good. I'm content with that.
Anything else on SS3? Very good, which I think, if I'm looking at the right version of the timetable, brings us to a conclusion for today, doesn't it?
Yes, sir. I was going to raise very briefly the process for main modifications. I know we have a couple of days left in the examination, but I thought I would raise it briefly now. You'll have seen that as matters stand, there is a draft composite schedule of main modifications which picks up on everything that has been proposed through the examination. What we hope to do after the close of the hearing sessions this week is to update that draft schedule to pick up changes which have emerged through the latest hearing sessions up to and including today. And as matters stand, we hope to do that in draft form by the second week in October. And with that draft list, we propose to send that to you in draft form, along with an associated list of documents which have been submitted to the examination since the last consultation. We need to fill out that list because there are some documents in the library, such as a notification notice or case law, for example, which wouldn't need to go out to consultation. But we would propose to consult on the main modifications as well as the list of documents that we propose to you in the correspondence we send in October. And we'd make changes to the policies map made available for comment as well in due course. Now, we anticipate that there need to be a change or exchange of correspondence on the modifications. There will be matters, obviously, you need to deliberate on before replying, matters which may need further clarification or amendment before the modifications go out. So we anticipate there being the need for a period of time for that correspondence to be exchanged. We're also aware that you have potentially site visits to do. So we'd anticipated that hopefully by around the second week in December, we were in a position to have main modifications subject to consultation, along with a list of documents to be consulted upon, agreed, all obviously without prejudice to your final conclusions in the report. During that time, we will obviously be working on sustainability appraisal, HRA work to pick up any modifications that are going out. And we also need to go through internal processes to essentially sign off the main modifications from the council point of view. And we'd anticipate being in a position to consult for 6 weeks from around the second week of February next year. And obviously, again, when the consultation goes out on the main mods and the documents, we would confirm that they're being put forward without prejudice to final report that you may be issuing. We propose that we can set out the anticipated dates in the correspondence that we send to you in October with the draft main mods and the list of documents. But that is our thinking at the moment, obviously subject to any comments that you have between now and possibly the end of the examination this week. But we thought it was appropriate to at least raise that now to give you time to reflect on it.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Mr. Linus. So we aren't in a position to commit to any firm timetable, as you will appreciate, although in principle and on the face of it, the kind of timetable that you're setting out appears to us at this stage to potentially be a reasonable one. Having said that, a couple of points. So yeah, as you point out, we do need to undertake our site visits, which may well have implications for having a fully updated main modification schedule by the second week in October. But I think you were talking about that all being finalised by the second week in December.
Yes, sir. We'd anticipated that from our end, we've got work to do to catch up with the modifications that have been discussed. But what we send to you in October, we know may not be the final modifications that are consulted upon. So we'd envisage the time between then and December, allowing for an exchange between the council and yourselves, and it gives you time to deliberate on matters which may require changes to the modifications that we send to you.
Okay, well, as I say, and with the long list of caveats I gave you in my previous comment,
yes,
that broadly sounds kind of reasonable. Yeah, you mentioned HRA work, and I don't think we've yet had the HRA that is specific to the, I can't remember the site number.
H59, sir. That note is currently with Natural England, who are just taking a look at it for completeness, and there was a slight delay there over the summer because of leave, but that should be with you fairly shortly.
Okay, that's helpful to know.
At the end of phase 2, towards the end of phase 2, the council, Mr. Eldon asked about if the inspectors were minded to give some additional interim findings or guidance. Now, I don't think anything's happened since then. I think he said, I think you wanted to wait until you'd had some of the other phases first. But are you likely or considering issuing any interim findings that can then be taken into account in this further process?
That depends. If we have soundness concerns which require some sort of remedy, whether it's through an additional main modifications or the council undertaking some aspect of further work or whatever, then we would, in that circumstance, set out interim findings. If, however, we don't have those sorts of soundness concerns, then we wouldn't set out interim findings. We would go simply to writing our final report.
Yes, sir. We accept entirely that the timetable that we have set out to you needs to be subject to a number of caveats, that being one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you know, Mr. Linus, then mentioned there are a number of caveats. So I think Mr. Linus got up to around the sort of second week in February to commence consultation on main modifications and all of the additional work that the council has produced through the examination process. At that point, just for the avoidance of any doubt, it will then be for us to read all of the representations that we get in response to that consultation, which may, of course, affect our thinking, which in turn might affect whether or not we need to set out interim findings or hold further hearings or whatever. So, hence, we can't be committal in terms of any specific timescale at the moment. Is that reasonably sort of clear to everybody insofar as it can be?
Yes, sir. We're clear that to a degree this is provisional, but we thought it was helpful to indicate to the public what the broad aspirations were, subject to the caveats you've mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and both for the benefit of everyone here today and for those watching at home, we will of course undertake our very best endeavours to make sure that the examination 5 years in continues as expediently in whatever direction we take it, but as soon as we possibly can, frankly, because we are very, very keen to get this examination moving to a conclusion one way or the other. So, yeah. Anything else on any of that before I otherwise adjourn for the day?
No, thank you, sir.
Mr. Merritt.
Just two brief comments. In terms of that timetable, that potentially has the consultation just before the election PERDA period. York has 4 yearly council elections, and they are due May next year. So there may, obviously we'd be concerned if the local plan ran into that period, and I'm sure the council is as well. So I'd just flag that.
Yes, well, it'll come as no surprise to Mr. Merritt that we're aware of that, which is why we're trying to make sure the consultation takes place as expeditiously as possible within that time frame.
Yeah. You asked me if I had any other thoughts on EC2 earlier. One thing that did cross my mind later, at the moment, if we're trying to protect existing employment sites and so on, at the moment, existing employment sites are not actually shown on the policy maps. So is that something that might help in terms of supporting policy EC2? I can see there's potential arguments both ways, but I just flagged that as a thought.
We understand the point, sir. We think it's preferable just to have the policy related to an existing use that can be identified on the ground, whilst there is one way of doing it is identifying these sites on the proposals map. There may be isolated sites or other ones which you want to have covered by the policy, which are not necessarily included on the policies map as matters stand. So we think it's better just to have the policy, and we can ensure that the protection of the policy is referable to what we see on the ground on any site, rather than relying exclusively or primarily on the proposals, but the policies map to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything else before I adjourn for the day? Very good. In which case, I make it 12:57. I adjourn the hearings to resume tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Till tomorrow.